Nash Granger thought the whole thing was a scam. A $1 deed to a cabin in the mountains, probably termite-infested, half-burned, and squatting on land no one wanted. But the moment he stepped off the bus and saw the towering silhouettes waiting by the fence line, all 4 women barefoot, unmoving, eyes fixed on him like prey, he knew he wasn't just claiming a property. He was walking into something ancient, something wrong, and something he might not survive. Before we dive in, let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if stories like this pull you in where forgotten places hide secrets, and strangers are watched like they were always meant to arrive, hit that subscribe button. Because tomorrow's tale might just explain why the land called for you too. The gravel road had ended an hour ago, and now it was just dirt, pine needles, and the crunch of his boots in a place no one had walked for a long time. Nash adjusted the straps on his pack and pulled the deed from his pocket again. Though he'd read it so many times, the corners were soft from sweat. $1. Property transfer. 1-bedroom log cabin. Partial acreage. Private title. No back taxes, no claim disputes. Just a cabin sitting alone on state-surveyed land nobody seemed to remember existed. It should have been silent here, the kind of silence you earn after being forgotten. But instead, the wind shifted, and he heard it. Footsteps. 4 sets, slow and deliberate, pacing around the cabin just up ahead. He ducked low behind a stump, heart thudding. The cabin wasn't empty. He crept forward, eyes scanning between trees, until the porch came into view, and that's when he saw them. 4 women, all standing in a line, facing the trail, facing him as if they knew the exact moment he'd arrive. They didn't wave, they didn't smile, just stared. One of them leaned against the railing, arms crossed. Her body was long, too long. Limbs like tree trunks wrapped in cotton dresses that hung loose around their enormous frames. They were barefoot, toes gripping the wood like roots. Nash froze. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. These weren't squatters, they were stationed, like guards. His throat was dry when he stood. "I'm Nash Granger," he called out, forcing steadiness. "I own this cabin now." The tallest of the women stepped down from the porch. She moved like a whisper, quiet, but with a weight that pressed on the air. Her head tilted slightly, examining him. "We know." The others followed behind her, not in unison, but with the same eerie calm. Nash tried not to back away. "I don't want any trouble. I have the paperwork here. It's not the cabin that matters," said another woman, her voice strangely childlike despite her towering form. "It's you." He blinked. "What?" "You're smaller than we thought," said a third. "But that's okay. Maybe that's even better." Nash clenched the paper in his hand. "This isn't yours anymore. I didn't know anyone was here. I bought it fair." The leader stepped closer. She had golden braids down to her waist and a face carved with symmetry, sharp and ancient. "We never lived in the cabin," she said. "We waited in it." Then she pointed one finger at him, not accusing, not threatening, just choosing. "And now that you're here, we can begin." Nash didn't move. The woman's finger stayed aimed at his chest, not shaking, not aggressive, just steady, like a compass that had finally found true north. The others flanked her in a loose half-circle, each one tall enough to tower over him by at least 1.5 feet. He didn't know where to look. Their faces weren't exactly identical, but they shared the same bone-deep stillness, not blank, but waiting, expectant, like predators who weren't hungry yet, but soon would be. Nash's mouth was dry, and his eyes darted to the cabin behind them, rough-hewn logs, moss along the eaves, smoke lazily curling from the chimney. Someone had been maintaining it. He'd thought it would be falling apart, but the porch was swept, the windows intact, and now it felt like walking into someone's home uninvited. Only they weren't acting like he'd intruded. They were acting like he'd finally arrived. "What do you mean, begin?" he asked, voice low but steady. The lead woman, the one with the braids, blinked slowly. "Your name is on the parchment. Your weight, your height, your lineage." Nash blinked. "Excuse me?" Another one stepped forward, softer in voice, rounder in the face, but no less imposing. "We've been watching the roads for weeks. Every sound in the trees, every broken twig. And now," she smiled, the expression tight and unsure, "you're here." Nash took a slow step back. "Look, I don't know what kind of cult setup this is, but I'm just here for the land. I bought it through a government auction." "Of course," the braided one said calmly. "That's how it always works. The land was just the hook. You were the catch." Nash blinked again, unsure if he'd heard her right. "The what?" "You are small," said the third one, short red hair, freckles, and eyes that shimmered unnaturally in the late day light. But symmetrical and unclaimed, added the fourth, the quietest of the group so far. She hadn't spoken until now. Her voice was almost reverent. That matters more than you know. Nash felt like he was being inspected, not like a man, but like a dog at auction. The way their gazes roved over him made his skin crawl. They weren't checking him out, they were evaluating, measuring, confirming. "What the hell is going on here?" he said, forcing the question through a rising sense of alarm. "Why are you all acting like I'm some kind of I don't know chosen one?" The braided woman's lips quirked slightly, not quite a smile. "Because you are." Nash's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Okay, no offense, but I don't think I'm the guy you're looking for. I'm broke, I live out of a backpack, and I haven't been chosen for anything in my life except maybe bad decisions." That almost earned a laugh from the redhead. "You'll fit right in then." Nash took another step back. "You know what? I think I'll just head back into town and sort this out with the county office." But as he turned, the world shifted subtly. But enough. The trees looked thicker now. The trail felt farther. And when he turned back, the women hadn't moved. "You already crossed the line," the soft-voiced one said gently. "The land knows you now. You can't leave until it decides." And the words landed on Nash's chest like cold rain. "The land knows you now. You can't leave until it decides." He wanted to laugh it off, call it superstition, but every instinct he'd learned on the road, every back alley bar fight and midnight hitchhike told him this wasn't just talk. The forest was too still, even the wind had gone quiet, like the trees were listening. He swallowed hard. "Look, I don't know what game you're running, but I didn't sign up for this." The braided one tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing. "No one signs up. They're called." The other three shifted subtly behind her, a movement so synchronized it made Nash's stomach clench. It wasn't rehearsed. It was ritual. He forced himself to breathe slowly and raised the deed again like a talisman. "This is legal. This is mine." The tallest woman's gaze dropped to the paper, then back to his eyes. "The paper brought you here. That's all it was ever meant to do." Her tone wasn't mocking, it was almost sad. Nash's thumb rubbed the edge of the document. "Then what do you want from me?" The redhead's lips parted, but she hesitated, glancing at the others. The quietest one stepped forward, her enormous hands clasped as if in prayer. "We've never known a man," she said, voice trembling in a way that made Nash pause. "Not because we couldn't," she added quickly, "but because we weren't allowed. Until now." For a second, Nash thought he'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" The redhead exhaled sharply, like she'd been holding the words in for years. "We're forbidden. That's what we were raised into. But when the parchment named you, the prohibition ended. You're the first one we've been permitted to touch." Nash's stomach nodded. He'd expected some kind of scam about money or land, not this. "Permitted by who?" he asked. But the question only deepened their silence. They stared at him, eyes glinting with something between hunger and hope. The braided woman, Callista, he'd overheard one of them call her, spoke finally, her voice low. "Our mothers, their mothers, all the way back. We were bred to wait. We don't even know the beginning anymore. Only that we were told, one day, a small man would come, and the cycle would change." Nash took a step back, but found his heel against the porch step. He hadn't even realized he'd been moving closer. "Okay, I don't know what you think is going to happen here," he said, his voice cracking. "But whatever you're planning, I'm not interested." Callista's gaze softened a fraction, and that softness was more unsettling than her coldness had been. "It's not about planning. It's about need. About ending a hunger we don't understand." Her eyes flicked to the other three, and for the first time Nash saw it not menace, but longing. The way their hands fidgeted, the way their breathing changed when he spoke. This wasn't a seduction. It was something older, stranger, and whether he liked it or not, he was inside it now. He waited until after midnight. The women had gone quiet hours ago, their towering forms moving through the cabin like ghosts, brushing against lantern light and old timber with the ease of people who'd memorized every corner of their world. Nash had tried to play along, nodding, keeping his distance, eating the roasted root vegetables they placed in front of him without question. He asked them no more questions. He didn't need to. Every answer they'd given so far had only deepened the pit in his gut. He waited until he was sure they'd gone to their rooms or whatever passed for bedrooms in this place. There were no doors, just thick curtains made from stitched animal hides. Nothing inside this cabin closed, and the cabin door, it didn't lock. Not from the inside, anyway. He tested the knob again. Smooth. Solid. But the latch was broken. Or maybe it never existed. He'd pushed a table in front of it, angling it under the handle like a wedge, but something told him it wouldn't hold. The structure creaked with every gust of wind, though the air outside was eerily still. He slipped on his boots without tying them, grabbed his pack, and moved as quietly as he could toward the door. He didn't even hear her until she was 5 feet away. "You won't make it far," said Callista from behind him, her voice not angry, not even surprised, just factual. Nash spun, adrenaline flaring through his chest. "You following me?" She didn't step closer. She just stood in the middle of the room, arms at her sides, her golden braids hanging loose over one shoulder. Her eyes, in the lantern light, didn't look human. "I'm not here to stop you," she said softly. "I just thought you should know the woods don't go the way you remember anymore." Nash clenched his jaw. "What does that mean?" "It means you already passed the marker," came another voice from the hallway, Bryn, the redhead. She leaned against the log wall like it was hers. "The land seals behind you when the name is accepted. We didn't do that. It's just how it works." Nash's hand tightened around the doorframe. "So you're telling me I'm trapped here?" Lyra's voice, the quiet one, floated in from behind the stove. "You're held, not trapped. There's a difference." "Not from where I'm standing," Nash growled. "If I can't leave, then this isn't a choice." Noah the fourth, the one who rarely spoke, stepped into view now. Her eyes were gentle, but her arms crossed like stone. "We didn't choose the rules," she said. "We only live inside them." Nash looked between them, the 4 giants who weren't monsters, but weren't entirely women either, at least not in any way he'd ever known. They weren't forcing him. They weren't touching him. But the space between their bodies and his was no less oppressive than shackles. "I just want to go," he said. "I didn't ask for this." Callista nodded, her face unreadable. "None of us did." She reached into her robe and pulled something small, glinting, and ancient, a key made of bone. "But if you want to understand what this really is, there's a chest in the cellar. You deserve to see it before you decide what kind of prison this really is." The cellar door groaned like something alive. Nash held the bone key tight in his hand, its grooves warm from where Callista had placed it. She hadn't followed him down, none of them had. They'd simply stepped back and let him pass, as if this part of the journey couldn't be guided. The stone steps were narrow, curved, and older than the house above them. He knew that instantly. The air changed halfway down, colder, but not damp. It wasn't rot that lived here. It was memory. The cellar opened into a small, circular chamber lined with wooden shelves, each one cluttered with jars of herbs, preserved roots, carved figurines, and folded cloth that looked like it had never been washed, only replaced. But in the center of it all sat a black iron chest, small, square, and humming faintly like a tuning fork beneath his feet. Nash crouched. The lock had no number, no brand, just a circular hole that looked like it would only fit a key made from bone. He slid the key in and turned. The sound it made was not mechanical. It was deeper, a click that echoed like something settling in his blood. He opened the lid. Inside, a single scroll rested on a bed of white cloth. Not parchment, not paper. Something smoother, sturdier. The script was gold, and it glittered without light. He unrolled it carefully. His name was the first thing he saw. Nash Calder Granger. His full legal name, written in calligraphy that no one from his world would have used. Below it, his date of birth, his parents' names, and a small black fingerprint pressed beside it, his fingerprint. The same swirl he'd studied on his own thumb for years. He kept reading. A contract, but not for property, not for a cabin. This was a claiming. A generational tether, forged not by modern law but by something older. Nash wasn't just a buyer, he was a descendant. A return. One of the few whose bloodline matched the terms of the original covenant set by the matriarchal guardians of the High Pines. The 4 women above weren't trespassers, they were wardens. The contract described them as hollow vessels awaiting rekindling. Nash stared at those words for a long time. He turned the scroll over and saw drawings, symbols he didn't understand. A man, small, surrounded by 4 towering figures, not unlike the women above. They held his hands, his chest, his heart. He was glowing, or maybe evaporating. The last line chilled him. The union is the unlocking. The body is the key. The seed is the gate. Nash backed away from the chest, the scroll still in his hands. This wasn't folklore. It wasn't metaphor. It was specific, anatomical, intentional. He looked around the chamber. The shelves weren't just storage, they were preparation. He stood slowly, the scroll folded under his arm. The air felt heavier now. He climbed the stairs, one hand on the wall, heart thumping in time with a fear that had evolved into something else, something darker, more intimate. When he reached the top, all 4 women were waiting. None of them spoke, but their eyes locked on the scroll in his hand, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he saw something unguarded flash across their faces. They were scared, not of him. For him, the fire had burned low by the time Nash stepped back into the main room, scroll still in hand, but the cabin wasn't cold. If anything, the air was too warm close, like breath against skin. The 4 women stood apart now, not in formation, not blocking exits, not looming with purpose. They just stood unsure, watching him like he carried not a contract but a mirror they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. None of them asked what he'd read. They knew. That was the worst part. The knowing in their eyes. Callista was the first to break the silence. She didn't move toward him, just lifted her chin slightly, the braids swaying down her back. "Now you see what we are." Nash swallowed. "You're not trying to hurt me." The words felt ridiculous in his mouth, but he needed to say them out loud. "You're scared." Bryn crossed her arms, the tough one always first to react. "We don't fear men." Nash looked her dead in the eyes. "You fear needing one." That hit harder than he expected. Her jaw tightened, but she looked away. Noah, the quiet one, shifted on her feet. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We were made to wait, to want, but never taught what comes after." Nash stepped forward slowly. The scroll still rolled in his palm like a torch that lit everything too honestly. "This thing, this contract, it says I'm the key, that I unlock something." His voice broke slightly and not from fear. "That it has to be physical." Lyra, the softest of them, flinched. "We don't even know what that means." Bryn cut in again. "We know the mechanics, but not the aftermath." Nash's heart thumped in his chest. The contract wasn't a trick. It was a prophecy with biological requirements. And none of these women, despite their size, their strength, their legacy, had ever so much as kissed a man. He glanced at each of them. They weren't naive. They weren't children. They were ancient vessels filled with inexperience, told to wait, to prepare, to be worthy, and then abandoned by the world that gave them nothing but rules. And now here he was, expected to do what generations of silence had built up to. Touch, connect, ignite. But how do you approach desire when it's never been yours? How do you reach for intimacy when it's been ritualized into sacred fear? He stepped toward Lyra first, not because she was weakest, but because her fear was closest to the surface. She didn't move, just stood there trembling slightly, breath shallow, her enormous hands curled into unsure fists. "Have you ever been touched?" Nash asked gently. Her eyes welled immediately, and she shook her head. "Anywhere, only by them," she whispered, glancing to the others. "Never by someone who didn't have to." He raised a hand, slowly giving her all the time in the world to say no. When his fingers brushed her cheek, she gasped like she'd been burned. But she didn't pull away. The moment cracked something in the room. Callista's breath hitched. Noah looked like she might cry. Bryn had turned away, fists clenched tight, teeth gritted not in anger, but restraint. Nash realized then, desire wasn't the danger, confusion was. They had waited so long to be touched, they'd forgotten how to ask for it. The next morning, the women were gone. The cabin was still, the hearth reduced to embers, the table cleared, every sign of last night's conversation erased like chalk in the rain. Nash sat alone in the center of it. The scroll unrolled again on the table, its golden letters now more familiar, terrifying in their specificity. The body is the key. The seed is the gate. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt Lyra's cheek under his fingers, the way she'd leaned into it with such desperate hunger, like that single touch had split open years of silence. A sound outside broke the stillness, a rhythm, slow and deliberate, like fabric brushing stone. Nash stepped to the window. The forest hadn't changed, but the trail that had led him here was no longer visible. In its place, a thin line of white powder chalk or ash stretched from the edge of the yard into the trees. 4 sets of footprints marked its path, each one huge, barefoot, and deliberate. He knew it was meant for him. He followed. The path twisted through pines and low brush, curving as if guided by memory rather than terrain. After 15 minutes, the trees opened into a grove. Stone pillars ringed its edge smooth, moss-covered, and tall enough to dwarf even the women. At the center stood a stone basin, waist high, filled with water so clear he could see the pebbles at the bottom. The four of them were waiting. They were no longer in simple cotton dresses. Callista wore a robe of dark red, braided tightly at the waist. Bryn was in deep green, her arms bare, hands wrapped in ceremonial cloth. Noah wore blue, her hair loose and eyes glassy like she'd been crying. Lyra was in white, the only one barefoot, her steps unsteady, her hands trembling. Nash froze at the edge of the grove. "What is this?" Callista stepped forward, her voice calm but taut. "The ritual. The true one. Not what's written in scrolls, but what was passed down by voice. Only to us," Bryn added. "There's no altar, no chains, no sacrifice." Noah nodded. "It's not about domination. It's about return." Lyra took a step closer to him. "You are not here to give us what we've never had. You're here to remember what you've forgotten." Nash's pulse thundered in his ears. "I don't understand." Callista reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out something small. A stone amulet, etched with concentric circles that pulsed faintly in the sunday. "Every man chosen before you was afraid. They thought this was about sex, about breeding, about submission, but it was always about this." She placed the amulet in his hand. The moment it touched his skin, a current ran through him, not painful, but cold, deep, familiar, like falling into a dream he'd had before birth. The grove blurred around him. He saw images not of the women, but of himself, or versions of himself, across lifetimes, different lands, always smaller, always arriving, always standing before them. When he opened his eyes, the women were closer, not threatening, just waiting. "The ritual," Callista said softly, "is remembering that you've always been here, that your body is not just yours, it is the echo of something ancient. And when you open to us fully, we return to balance." Nash looked at the amulet, then at each of them, their robes, their restraint, their trembling hands. This wasn't a seduction, it was a restoration. The stone amulet still pulsed in Nash's palm as they led him deeper into the grove. No one spoke, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like prayer. The grove opened into a second chamber, not carved, not built, but grown. Vines formed walls, moss cushioned the floor, and above, the canopy spiraled into a perfect circle of open sky. At its center sat an old cedar chest, blackened with age. The women gathered around it like sisters around a grave. Bryn knelt first, her fingers trembling slightly as she unlatched the rusted iron clasp. "Every time one of you comes, we write it down, not just names, dreams, behaviors, fears." She opened the chest and withdrew a thick journal, leather-bound and swollen with moisture and time. She handed it to Nash. "This is your inheritance." Nash opened it slowly. The first pages were clean script, inked with reverence. A name, Elend Marin. Beneath it, a drawing of a man with dark eyes and a short beard. A date, the 14th of March, 1772. Next to it, a single word, returned. The next name, Hollis Ward, 1821. Fragmented. Then another, and another. Dozens of men. Their features different, but each one small, humble, unspectacular by the world's standards until they came here, until they were chosen. Some entries were long, detailed, others just a name and a verdict. Did not survive. Withdrew, awakened, merged. Nash's throat tightened as he turned page after page. They didn't all make it. Noah nodded slowly. "It doesn't always work." "Why?" Callista's voice was quiet. "Because it's not about strength. It's about surrender." He flipped to the most recent entry. No date. Just a sketch of a man who looked eerily like him. Same brow. Same eyes. Same half-smile he'd always hated in photos. The note beside it read, "He was almost ready." Nash blinked, stunned. "You drew this?" Lyra spoke, her voice small. "We dream them before they arrive. We knew your face before we knew your name." Nash closed the book gently. "What happened to the last one?" Bryn hesitated. "He left before it was complete." "Then how am I still here?" Callista stepped closer. "Because when they leave before completion, the gate stays open but bleeding. The balance breaks. The land frays. That's why your path in was so easy. The last man left it torn behind him." Nash stared at them, four women who had been raised not on love, but on legacy. Trained not in seduction, but in spiritual restraint. And every one of them carried the scars of failed rituals, Rituals that required him to step forward, not just as a man, but as something more. "So what happens?" he asked quietly. "If I finish what they couldn't?" Noah looked up at the sky. "Then we close the cycle," Bryn added. "And you become more than a visitor." Callista's eyes met his. "You become the last. The one who finally stayed." They gave him the option. That was the part that undid him. After everything, the scroll, the ritual grove, the chest of failed echoes, they still offered him a choice. No binding words. No veiled threats. Just Callista standing at the edge of the grove as dusk painted the treetops in amber, her hand resting on the carved post that marked the threshold between the grove and the world beyond. "There's still a path," she said softly. "We could open it for you, just long enough." Nash didn't speak. The others remained behind him, silent, watching. Not waiting to pounce, just bracing for the weight of being left behind again. Lyra had already stepped away, her arms wrapped around herself like a child who knew what abandonment felt like too well to cry about it anymore. Bryn stood with her jaw clenched, pretending not to care, and Noah sat on the mossy ground beside the cedar chest, hands in her lap like she'd already made peace with the idea that some men simply don't stay. Nash looked at the trail Callista gestured to. It hadn't been there before. The forest had split just enough to reveal a narrow corridor of light that shimmered faintly, as if the air inside it were thinner, more forgiving. A way out. Real. But temporary. He should have run. Any sane man would have. The longer he stayed, the deeper the threads wove around him, not physical ones, but emotional, spiritual, ancestral. This was no longer about sex. Or mysticism. It wasn't even about fate. It was about longing. 4 women carved by solitude. Generations engineered to hold in desire so long it hardened into need. And somehow, the key to unlocking it all had fallen into the hands of a man who had never once in his life been needed. "I could leave," Nash said, more to himself than to her. "Yes," Callista replied. "But you'd carry the wound with you, and it would grow louder every year." He turned to face her fully. "You don't know that." She stepped closer, her voice low. "I do, because we carry it too." Nash looked at each of them, now not as strange women from a forgotten ritual, but as beings full of longing. He saw Lyra's nervous fidgeting as her fingers traced the veins on her wrist. Bryn's cracked lips, she bit them when nervous. Noah's quiet resolve. And Callista's eyes, which for all their fierceness, flickered now with something Nash hadn't seen before. "Hope, I never stay," Nash whispered. "Anywhere. That's why you were chosen," Noah said softly from behind him. "Because this time, you can." He took one step toward them, then another, and another, and the trail behind him dissolved like dust in water. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't left. And in this place, that was everything. The word had haunted him from the beginning. Stud. It sounded crude, transactional, a label slapped on some breeding animal, not a person. When Lyra had first whispered it in the candlelight of that crooked cabin, it had sent a shiver down his spine, not from lust, but from the weight of expectation. Now, standing in the center of the grove at sunrise, the 4 women encircling him not like captors, not like worshippers, but something else entirely. Nash finally understood. They had never wanted a stud at all. They wanted an anchor. Lyra was the first to touch him, not with hunger, but with trembling reverence, her fingers resting on his collarbone like he was something holy. "It's not about the act," she whispered. "It's about the offering." Noah followed, kneeling gently at his side, her forehead brushing his shoulder. "We give you our years," she said. "All the untouched time, all the longing, all the restraint we bottled into silence." Bryn didn't speak. She simply pressed her forehead against his back, her arms wrapping around him tight, shaking, the strongest of them now clinging like she might shatter if he pulled away. And Callista, the one who had always seemed the most in control, simply cupped his face in her hands and said, "We've been alone too long. The world forgot how to receive us, but you didn't." The ritual began not with movement, but with breath, synchronized, 4 sets of lungs syncing with his. The grove pulsed faintly. The amulet around his neck, once cold and metallic, now radiated with warmth, heat, life. And then, as the sun cleared the canopy, the vines around them curled inward, not to trap, but to seal, to sanctify. Their touch wasn't sexual. It was cellular. Memory flowed into him. He saw fields that had never been planted, rivers that once sparkled with silver, voices of women long dead humming lullabies through his bones. Their lineage poured into his body like mist, not to consume him, but to complete him. Nash saw himself not as a man chosen, but as the missing limb of something ancient and feminine and powerful, and as their bodies pressed gently to his arms and shoulders and hair brushing skin like silk over stone, he understood the truth. The word stud had never meant object of pleasure. It had meant foundation, the beam that held the house. The still point in the storm, he held each of them in turn. Lyra cried without shame. Noah laughed, dizzy with release. Bryn bit back tears until they escaped like steam, and Callista simply looked at him with eyes that had seen centuries and finally softened. When it ended, they didn't speak. They lay in the grove, limbs tangled, hearts steady, silence absolute. Nash didn't feel claimed. He didn't feel used. He felt woven. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running. He wasn't surviving. He was held, and somewhere beneath the ground, whatever gate had waited sealed, not with fear, but with belonging.